We have three distinguished guests, and time is limited. There's always a lot to say, and the floor is yours. Whoever would like to start is welcome.
Start what?
That's a good question. I don't know. It depends on the starters. Would you like to go?
What's the subject?
I'm told, if my memory serves, it's about childhood in a religion, in a society where the majority belongs to other faith, let's say. Something like that.
That's a nice, good question.
So,
You want me to go first then?
Yeah, I think that's definitely...
great. Thank you. A brave
sounds
step
like a
forward.
thing you would be able to speak one about.
I'll disgrace myself first. Well, my name is Nadira Naipaul. Hello. I was born in 1953 in Africa, in Mombasa. I was born to a man who came to Mombasa to marry my mother, who was an only child of a Pathan foot soldier in the British Army. He had gone to Africa in 1914, in the First World War, and he had stayed there. So my father, due to circumstances with his land, found himself in Africa, and the condition that was imposed on him was that if he wanted to marry my mother, he had to give up Pakistan, because she was an only child. And at that moment, it suited him to give up Pakistan and to live in Africa. So I was born there. I had a strange upbringing in the sense that there was law and order. You must tell me when it's time, okay? I will keep quiet.
It'll never be time.
There'll never be time? Okay. I have a very hazy idea of the colonial period because as I was growing up, it was coming to an end. I had very little religious training as a child, and that was for the reason that, not that my father didn't want us to have it, we were born very late. He was 50 when I was born. And my mother thought I was menopause, but it was a baby. And so I had an Arab Maulam who used to come to teach me. I was a handful then, I still am. And the Maulam said to my father one day in Arabic that I am fed up. This is Tukhme Shaitan, the spawn of the devil. My father had been thrown out, so I had no religious training as a child. But when I grew up and independence took place and I went to an English school, my father suddenly, because of our lands and worry that he didn't want me to come to England. He was terrified that if I went to England, I would not be able to read the class system and I would marry a yob, or I would marry a common man. So he had me transported back to Pakistan at the age of 16. It was a great shock. Yet, I was quite patriotic in a way that Pakistan, in the Independence Day, although we lived a very Anglophilic life, I saw two contrasts as a child. I saw my father celebrating Independence Day, which was 14th of August, with fireworks. We had a great dinner, and in that dinner, my father wore Jinnah's cap, the Karkuli cap, and he had the entire community, the whites, the browns, a few blacks, at this great dinner because he was celebrating. Yet, my mother's maternal Pathan, Caucasian almost, grandfather, in his house, it was a day of great mourning. There was Quran, it was read right through, because my grandmother and my grandfather's entire clan, very few survivors, I think there were only 3 survivors, I have an aunt who I remember, were massacred in Amritsar. There were no survivors. And my grandfather, when he came to Pakistan, did not take any money, because at that time they were giving a lot of money. It was called evacuee property, money for what you had lost in East Punjab. But there was so much shock that he never took anything. He said he refused to take blood money. And in those days, I still remember that my grandfather used to abuse Gandhi, abuse Jinnah, and abuse the British equally. Yet, in my father's house, there was great celebration, because my father came from West Pakistan in Lahore, which independence was just handed to them on a plate. They lost nothing. Suddenly, there was immense wealth. The Hindus, who were very, very rich, there were very few rich Muslim families before partition, had suddenly gone, and then there was this great wealth. So I grew up with this contrast, and I came to Pakistan, and I then did my degree, A level, and then I wanted to be an artist, I wanted to be a painter, and my father said, why did I want to be promiscuous and louche? And because that was there, they only had military. They had either you were ladies, you had a little degree, and then you got married, and the man looked after you, and the men went into military or became doctors, nothing else. So that's my background. And then I went into, by fluke, I went to look after my lands in Bahawalpur. This is the boondocks of Pakistan. It is the backwaters of Pakistan. And it was a great shock to me to see what I was seeing. And I was seeing from the outside, because I had not grown up there. I didn't grow up seeing the iniquities. I didn't grow up to be desensitized to what was happening. And it is at that point in my life that I learned the Quran, and I learned the tarjumas, because I was up against a great force. And I had to know my religion in order to be able to challenge that force. So later on, I may read you small extracts of what I have written, very small, and then you can ask me questions. All right?
Good. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me like this, or do I need a mic? I was interested in Nadira's story because my story comes out of hers in a sense that I come from a Muslim family from Bombay that went to Pakistan in the mid-50s, somehow believing that Pakistan might be a very safe, prosperous and good place for Muslims from India to live. So my family moved to Karachi in the mid-50s, and my father came to Britain. Like many middle-class families from the subcontinent, they sent their kids to the United States and to Britain to be educated. My father then married my mother, and he never went back to the subcontinent again. I grew up in the 60s, and I was a white boy with a brown name or a Muslim name and an English mother, growing up at a time, I guess, of very unpleasant racism. Also a time when Britain was beginning to change. I didn't know it then, but it was beginning to change from a white monocultural society into the paradise that we now know it to be. And I began to become aware in the 70s when I started to write at the age of 14, 15, 16, that I needed to think about my father, my mother, my history, my place, and this very interesting question, which I was asked all the time in the suburbs where I was growing up. The question was, who are you? Or where are you from? Or where do you belong? Or are you one of us, or are you one of them? And after a while, these questions began to give me a headache. And they are very profound questions. very challenging existential questions, you might say. And so, in order to be able to think about some of these questions before I went mad, I thought I would write them. I would write them, and that writing then became for me a way of trying to think about my place in the world and who I might be. And I would guess that would be probably the case for most writers when they begin to work. To try and get some idea of who they might be in relation to the world they are in and to their parents.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I also look forward to hearing your questions, comments afterwards if we have time for that. The subject of childhood, it always intrigues me because I think it's not a static subject. I mean, it's not something that's bygone, we leave behind and it just stays there in a frozen format. We continuously reinterpret it. So at least that's my feeling. So depending on different times in my life, I felt differently about my childhood. But all I can do is just talk about maybe the broad line, the general lines. I was born in Strasbourg in France. And shortly after my parents got separated, I came to Turkey with my mom. And from then on, I was raised as a single child by a single mother, which at the time was a bit unusual because we were in this middle-class neighborhood in Ankara, which was full of large families, where fathers were the heads of households. So in a way, I grew up observing my mom's position as a woman without a male protector in a patriarchal environment. In fact, I grew up seeing two different types of womanhood. On the one hand was my mom, a well-educated, secular, modern, rational, westernized Turkish woman. And on the other hand was my grandmother, who also took care of me, and she was much more spiritual, less educated, and definitely less rational. This is a woman who eats coffee grounds, who pours melted lead into mysterious shapes to ward off the evil eye. So there are all sorts of superstitions that I bring with me still back from those days. When I was around the time I was 9 or 10 years old, my mother became a diplomat. And from that middle-class environment in Ankara, I was zoomed into this very posh international school in Madrid, in Spain, where I was the only Turk. And that, of course, was my first encounter with what I came to call as the representative foreigner. There were many, in our classroom, there were students from all sorts of nationalities and religions, but I realized this diversity did not necessarily create an atmosphere of cosmopolitan, egalitarian, classroom democracy. What it created instead was an atmosphere in which every child was seen not as an individual on his own, but as the representative of something, larger than him, as the representative of a nation or a religion. We were like a mini United Nations, which was fun, but except whenever something negative happened or negative, grabbed the headlines, the child who represented that religion or nation was mocked and ridiculed and bullied endlessly. So, you come to see those things, and it was the 1980s. It was the time when a military takeover happened in Turkey, when you would remember this Turkish gunman tried to kill the Pope, or Turkey used to get, only once got 0 points in the Eurovision Song Contest. So many things, and I really skipped school often when I was in Madrid. I wanted to be a sailor. I didn't like school at all. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I was a very lonely child. I was a very introverted child, and that's part of the reason fiction became so crucial for me. I started writing fiction when I was 8 years old. Everything started with a diary, in fact. My mother came home one day with a turquoise notebook. She said, would you like to keep a personal journal? In retrospect, I think she was slightly worried about my sanity because I was telling stories all the time at home, which was good, except I told this to imaginary friends around me, which was not that good. So I was very introverted. I apologized to objects when I bumped into them. So it was, you live in your imaginary world, and that's why it did me good to start to write fiction. The thing is, when I started writing, I realized the last thing I wanted to do was to write about myself. I thought my life was terribly boring, it was terribly dull. So instead of writing about me, I started writing about other people and things that never really happened. and thus began my lifelong passion for fiction.
Now, although officially I'm the moderator here, it would be more colorful, I think, if all three of you would simply go ahead and ask one another questions instead of waiting at me or others. I'm sure.
Well, you know, I understand what you say, that you are an outsider in a school, and you're Madrid, but you know what? I look at I know Hanif will also have similar, as he mentioned, experiences of this bullying and racism. When I went to my school, my school, it was an English school, and it was a real Paka English school. The name was Sir Richard Burton. You couldn't get more imperial than that, yeah? And we had to wear the British flag. It was white with a little bit of St. George red. And the first day when I went to school, the children, my brother and we sat on the bench, and suddenly we were all alone on the bench. All the other children very silently got up and went and sat on the other bench. Well, you're 6 years old, you don't think. My brother was 6, I was 7. Suddenly, 2 children came and they sat next to me and my brother, and they put their arm like this. Now they were Jewish children. Now her name was Zipporah, her brother's name was David, and her other sister was Susanna. I have never forgotten their names. Now they sat like this, and so we were only 4 children sitting there. My brother was a bully. He was a mean machine. He was small, he was tiny, and he packed a mean punch. So very soon he had all the boys there, and he was a real swine because he used to make sure the teachers weren't there, and he would put his face on this English boy and say I'm a pig, say I'm a pig. And the boy would say, yes, Faisal, I'm a pig, and he'd let go. Now that boy, David, on every Saturday, the Jews would come wearing a little skull cap. That boy, David, was tormented in school. They would come and flip the cap off. And because he was tiny and small, he would pick it up and he'd put it back, and they'd flick it again. Now, later, my brother then, one day, was walking past and saw this. There were about 6, 7 boys. Now, they never touched me, they never said anything to me, they were afraid of him. I remember my brother came up and he picked that cap up and he put it on David's head, and he looked at these English boys and he said, the cap stays. They never bullied David again. But that little bit of bullying was very good for me now when I look back. We never complained. We could never go home and tell our parents. We were too ashamed, frightened. We didn't know. How can you tell your parent who's forking out a huge amount of money to send you to that school that you hate it? So you fight. You become a fighter. We were both fighters. And I know that when I went to Pakistan, my entire career, I was known as somebody really mean and mad and bad where it came to minorities. I would do anything for the minorities. I would go right up to the assembly, right up to the Senate. I was not afraid. I remember when I met my husband, V.S. Naipaul, the first thing my husband said to me, are you not afraid? And I said, no, I am not afraid, because there is no antidote to fear. Once it takes you over, you're finished. And the only reason why these swines listen to me, they're afraid. They're afraid of that pen. But it was my experience of that bully, of that being the outsider, being really rubbish, made to feel as rubbish, that I could not allow it to happen in my country. It was my country. And the minorities are very badly pressed. So I think it does shape us in a way. Don't you think, Hanif, it shapes you?
Well, I think being a child is a nightmare for everybody.
I bet.
There isn't anybody here who hasn't had a traumatic childhood.
Yeah.
there's no escape from being a child. Being an adult is even worse in my experience. And being an adult really is to try and work out who you were as a child. And I guess that's what we were talking about earlier. That is what it is to be some sort of artist. To try and work out, particularly as you were saying, your relation to your parents, the past, and who you are. But also to see that your view of them and of your childhood, it changes all the time. When you're 10, when you're 20, when you're 50, when you're 80, you have a different view of your parents too, and it's constantly revised. And that is what it is to be creative, I think. If it wasn't revised, you'd be stuck.
Yeah.
And I guess that would be what they would call a trauma.
Trauma.
The word trauma the things you have mentioned lead us to think that trauma is directly maybe necessary for literary productivity or creativity.
No, it's what it is to have a life.
More than that, yes.
It is to experience, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's some truth in that, but I don't want to exaggerate it because I think as writers, as artists, we have this tendency to exaggerate the role of trauma, and the role of darkness.
Are we talking about personal trauma?
Yeah, personal trauma, yeah, definitely. And how that affects and generates creativity, which is true, but it's not necessary. So, I mean, if you didn't have an unhappy childhood, you can still be a writer. So there's always some.
Good point.
Really, I mean, and on the other hand, I mean, I very much agree with what you said. But on the other hand, no childhood is completely black. There are always very, very positive sides in it. So I think it all depends on what we choose to remember when, at which stage in our lives.
What do you say to that?
I think to be a child at all is to live in great difficulty, and I think it's very interesting the extent to which we try and idealize or romanticize childhood, or indeed sentimentalize it, because we're all aware of how awful it is and how difficult it is. And I think that is the case for everybody. I mean, that is just the normal human process. I don't think that is. You can't recover from that. I think it's what it is to be a human being. And one of the things we try and do is symbolize that. And I guess that's what writing might be. I mean, we talk about writing as therapy, but it seems to me that everything we do, in a sense, is a form of therapy, or to try and understand that which can't be understood.
Yeah. Or to leave a document. I remember that when I started writing, and I came to writing as an accident, I used to work with the minorities. These are Christians, mostly Christians and Hindus, who were bonded labor. They're just bonded to the land, and they can never escape it. So they're like serfs in this modern world. And also women. And I used to come back to Lahore, which was the cultural capital of Pakistan, and Islamabad is our Washington. And I would meet people like Khalid Ahmed, and old newspaper friends and the newspaper owners, and I would tell them, what the hell are you writing? This is all crap. This is what's happening, and that is Pakistan. This is not Pakistan. It is the boondocks that is Pakistan, the rural areas. And they said to me, look, why don't you just write? So what I started to write, because I had to. I felt that there was nothing there. There was nobody representing them. Although they had members of parliament and people in the Senate, nobody spoke of these unwashed masses. They were teeming, our population. Not the elite, not the gentry. This is underneath. So when you start writing, and it became, they thought it was a joke. First they said to me, we're not going to pay you. You realize that? I said, fine, don't pay me. In 6 months, 3 newspapers were fighting for the column. And they were bidding each other, what do you want? Because it was a new I was looking from the outside. I was not looking as a Pakistani. I was looking from outside, saying, what is happening here? What are we looking at? But after 10 years of writing, or 12 years of writing, I can tell you, I only wrote because I had to. And I was fed up. I thought it is useless. It was preaching to the converted, because we had an English newspaper and the sister newspaper was an Urdu newspaper. We were never translated into Urdu. We were just kept there as writers to show the West, look how democratic we are. We allow her to say all this nonsense, this rubbish. You know, she's saying it. So we were never put for the masses. And then after some time, I felt that I would leave a human document. It was nothing more. I was burnt out in the sense that I thought it's not going to change, nothing will happen. It's a kind of madness here. We are against greater forces than, but for these people, let us leave a document that this did happen. So that's what happens at the end. You at least think that writing is, you know, you're doing something worthwhile like this, that you just keep.
I have two questions in my mind. One of them is...
you speak a bit louder.
Pardon?
Speak up.
Oh, sorry. At what point in your life writing or enjoying writing became led to the idea of becoming a writer? I mean, when did you, how did you decide to become a writer, approximately?
Well, I
So
think,
all three.
I think this is a very interesting question. It's an interesting question because I had the misfortune to teach writing. And there's a big difference between writing, as it were, for yourself, for pleasure, for your friends, and doing it for a living. And being a professional writer is a very, very difficult thing, and there aren't many people who can do it, and there aren't many people who can do it for a long time. I've been writing most of my life, and I can say it's difficult to make a living. You may have one hit or two hits or whatever. It's sustaining it for a long time and then supporting your family and so on is a completely different matter. Because you're working in the market. And I'm very interested, because I also write films and work in the cinema when I can get the work, interested in the crossover between commerce and art. And that's when things, for me, get really interesting, because as a writer or as a filmmaker or as a film writer, you are making work for the public, for other people. And if other people don't like what you do, you've had it. So we're not talking about artists who are writing, as it were, for their own pleasure, as a diary, but making a product that other people might want to read. And if they don't want to read it, you're in trouble. And thinking about that is something that, certainly in the writing schools, people don't talk enough about. And I think, as I say, that working for the market is a really good thing. It's a very important thing. It really gives you discipline. And it makes you think what the other might want. And is likely to stop your work being self-indulgent. On the other hand, the greatest writers of the 20th century, the writers that we admire, like Beckett or Kafka or Proust or Joyce or whatever, you wouldn't think of them as they're modernists, as artists working for the market. So there's quite a lot to say about this.
I guess in my case, I can think of two different starting points. As I said, I started writing at the age 8, but that was not because I wanted to become a novelist or, you know, at the time I didn't even know there was such a way of, you know, such a lifestyle. It was a necessity for me, and it was like an animal instinct. So, and I followed that animal instinct. And to me, that beginning is very genuine. The desire to become a novelist, you know, the desire to become, you know, to sell more, such things are much more related to our egos. And as writers, I think we have huge egos. We have inflated egos. We have it more than any, you know, all other artists, because the type of work we are doing is a very lonely work. You know, we don't know teamwork. We don't know how to work with other people. Sometimes for weeks, months, years, we retreat into our imaginary cocoon. We think we're little gods, you know, creating characters, killing characters. So there is that ego. There is this self-centered nature in our work, which I think we need to learn to balance with other things in our life. But what I'm trying to say is the desire to become a writer, the desire to do this and that is more related with the ego. The need to write is something else, and that, in how I experienced this, that preceded the desire, which came to me in my early 20s. In time, I felt it as if wherever I went, because after Spain we went to other countries, we came to Ankara, and then I lived in Boston, Michigan, Arizona, and back in Istanbul again. So wherever I went, I felt like, you know, my imagination, my writing was like the only suitcase that I could take with me. It gave me a sense of continuity. It gave me a sense of center and coherence in life, which I lacked otherwise. And another beginning for me was when I started writing in English. English for me, like millions of other people in the world today, is an acquired language. You know, I did not grow up bilingual. And today they ask me a lot this question, you know, why am I writing in English? Because I write both in English and Turkish fiction, which is a bit unusual in Turkish literary scene today. But the only answer I can give to that is that it gives me a chance to recreate myself. And I guess I like to commute back and forth between languages. I feel very connected to Turkish, which to me is a very emotional, you know, I have a very emotional bond with it. And to me, it's a very poetic language. English for me is a more mathematical language. Maybe it's not the case for a native speaker. I don't know that. But what I'm trying to say is, today in this world, there's so many people who dream in more than one language. You know, people who dream in 2 languages, in 3 languages, and they keep commuting back and forth. When you're an outsider in a language, or when you're a latecomer, what happens is you always live with a sense of frustration. You always want to say more, you always want to speak, you know, in a wittier way, you want to crack better jokes, but you can't. Your mind is always faster, your tongue is lagging behind. So there's a gap between. And you learn to live with that gap, which is very frightening. But if you learn not to be intimidated by it, it's also stimulating. So when I look back, I see all these different beginnings in my connection with fiction.
Well, little God, what do you have to say?
I would say that that the struggle with language that you were talking about is the essence of what it is to be a writer, that you struggle, as it were, with your material, and you struggle with it all the time. But it has to be difficult writing, and there have to be new difficulties for you all the time. I mean, it would be pointless to do something that was easy, and it would be pointless to do something that was too difficult. You have to have some resistance in the material that you then, at the end, overcome after a long period of frustration, and that's called being an artist, and it's a continual process. The frustration, release, and then you've got something, you've done something, you've achieved something, and then you start again. So I think what you were saying about language is very interesting, because I don't think it's unique to someone who is not born to a particular language, but it's to do with what it is to be an artist in relation to their material.
What about a sense of humor here? Now, Hanif and I share it because we have English as our mother tongue, really.
Right.
And so we have this very, you needn't look so perplexed, the play on words. What about your sense of humor? Since you have English as an acquired language, is it Turkish? Is it what? Do the Turks have a sense of humor?
Of course we do. But I understand your question, and I find it very intriguing. I think, yeah, we do have humor. We also have black humor, if I may call it that way. And humor in Turkey has been a very powerful way to criticize regimes, to criticize governments, even, in times when there were more oppressive regimes. So humor works in a very creative way, and it's very
much more in humor.
Very open to both women and men. But when it comes to irony, I would say maybe irony is something else, and irony is something I find it easier in English.
Yes, that's true.
All the great writers are funny. There isn't a great writer who isn't funny. I can't think of one. Obviously Shakespeare, Dickens, Kafka apparently is hilarious. Beckett, of course, is very, very funny writer. Nothing cheers me up before I go to bed. There's a bit of Beckett. I'm away. So it's impossible to detach great writing from humour, because the world is funny, and it's only funny because it's awful.
But you know, Hanif, something very odd, and I want you to help me here, because I could be wrong.
I will.
I know you, but you're a gentleman. When I was taken from this very English school, where you were punished if you didn't say I, and the Scottish boy and I, and the Scottish boys and myself were always with dunce gaps, because they would say iron, and they would say I will know, I will not, I will know. So we were always in a corner, and from there, and you had irony, and you had that. And suddenly in Pakistan, where I lived for a very long time, honey, I lost the language. I lost English as the Pakistanis speak it, you know, a different kind. There was no irony in it. I remember that when I came back to England at the age of 40, and I would meet my various English friends, and sometimes it took me a long time to get back in that cycle. Like when you're saying something and somebody looks at you and says charming, and you think, my God, you forget that charming is an insult. It took me a long time to step back into language. So you can lose it, can't you? You can, if you're not in the setting and you're speaking a babu kind of English, you can lose it.
Well,
irony.
If we're lucky, I mean, we're all creative, and the most creative thing that we do, and we do it all the time, and it's a very odd thing, is speak to one another. And speaking, of course, is a form of art. It's a form of, you know, we are writing novels in conversation, etc. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Before the audience, there's one question. Since the topic is partly at least childhood, religion, etc., the notion of God, did it have a place in your mind when you were a child? And if so, specifically Islam, that's related to Islam. The concept of hell, did it bother you? Did you feel guilty? And when you felt guilty, did the notion of hell bother you when you were a child? And how did you cope with it?
Nobody's ever asked me that question before.
I think
It's a great question.
It's a big question. You have to break it up into smaller bits.
Well, first, did you have some sort of belief in, let's say, Islamic God, Allah, let's say, when you were a child?
You know, as I said, I grew up with my mom, who was more secular, but my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was definitely, she was very, very attached to. She was not a Sufi, but she was. Let me put it this way. I mean, I'm someone who believes that there's more to this world than we can perceive with our five senses. When I look back, I realized there was a time when, a very brief time, when I was with my paternal grandmother, and this was a woman who spoke a lot about hell and punishment. To her, God was like a celestial gaze who was always watching us and writing down every little, sin, even those that crossed our minds and were not even, realized. And I remember coming back, they were in Izmir, coming back from her house, slightly traumatized, because there was a lot of fear in her approach, in her interpretation of Islam. However, when I came to this other grandmother, with whom I spent a much longer time, her understanding of Islam was completely different. And at the first glance, these are women from very similar backgrounds, very similar class structures, but her understanding was one that's put love at the center. And to me, this was, like a big revelation, because sometimes we lose those nuances. Yeah. Like in Turkish, I mean, those in the audience who speak in Turkish would perhaps agree with this. I can name 6 or 7 different words for headscarf. how do I translate all that complexity into English? I have only one word, the veil. You know, all those nuances are lost. My interest, I'm someone who's very interested in religious philosophy, Islamic philosophy in particular, and Sufism, especially. My interest in Sufism began when I was a student at college. And to this day, to me, it's a big dilemma why it started, because I wasn't raised like this. There weren't any friends around me who were connected with Sufism. I didn't know anyone, it was never visualized, materialized around me. But like many other things in life, books opened the door for me to Sufism. I started reading, Anwar Shima, Elif Shafak, people like him, and one book leads to another. Now, all throughout these years, it never abandoned me. At the beginning, it was a more cerebral, perhaps intellectual curiosity. In time, it became a matter of heart. But I have a lot of interest in Sufism, and in many ways, I find parallels between the art of storytelling and Sufism, this desire to transcend the self that has been given to you by birth. Because we're all born into a certain, self, right? By our family, our class, our nation, our religion. But how do I transcend that? How do I connect with the whole humanity, that interconnectedness? I think that's very vital in Sufism as well as in the art of storytelling.
Well, you said something very interesting about Sufism, but that depends where are you coming from. When I look at myself, I see the Pathan grandfather that I was talking about earlier, who was a foot soldier in the British Army. Now, he was a Wahhabi. Now, that is really, my mother had never seen another man aside from her father and then my father. And she was covered from here to here. And you couldn't see her hands. And it was her great good fortune that she married the most Anglophilic man in Africa. And he set her free to a point that he regretted it. Because my mother's low necks were coming down and down and down to a point that he protested. All that hiding, that hijab and everything, she was on the other extreme after being liberated. But I think she could never escape those roots because she was terrified of us, my brother and myself, not having religious that she had. And she used to look at us, and she couldn't say anything to my father because although he was a great Anglophile and an autocrat, she had her place. If he said the children are going to do this, that was the end. And she would look at us coming back from the school and staying away, going out for these holidays and no religious thing, and she would look and say, my God, on the day of resurrection, do you know you and your brother are going to have heads of pigs because you have not done the Quran, and you will come, and what am I going to say to God? Now, we were very droll and we had a sense of humor. I used to look at her and say, okay, when you have two pigs coming towards you, you know it's me and my brother. So, chill, So my attitude, and I had a grandmother who was even like yours, but worse, who was constantly fear the God of wrath. He was there all the time. But on the other side, there was no God really. My father was a free thinker. He said, be humane. He had seen my brother, I have an older brother and sister, who had complete religious training, complete with everything. They were the greatest scoundrels that walked the earth. And after that, when my father saw those two, he thought these two need no religion. But when I went to Pakistan, I had to learn it. I had to learn it with tarjuma, with a translation, because when I was up challenging the mullah, when he threw a hadith at me, I knew that I could throw one back. So that was extremely important. But that, like you, I grew up with humanity. That was my God. It still is.
My question is to Mr. Kureishi. Naipaul.
You need the mic.
I can shout really. When you were students, when you were children, what did they teach you in history classes? within Turkey it's a bit problematic because they teach us, for example, all our enemies. This is an enemy, this is an enemy, this is an enemy. So we learn our enemies, and some of those enemies are today Turkish citizens, but we're proud that we have killed them in the past, so it's a bit weird today how we should feel about them. What's the problem in England? When you were studying about India or Pakistan, your native countries in England, what did you teach?
Well, we were brought up not to like Germans.
Yes, and Japanese.
And nobody likes Germans anyway, so
Like the Japanese.
it's fine with the Germans.
Now they do.
Yeah, the Germans are all right now, aren't they? Yes. They're playing Argentina today, so we're supporting the Germans today.
We were growing up at the end of the colonial period. So for me, history was European history as a child. And then it suddenly became from French, like we were learning French, and suddenly we were learning Swahili. So, and then my history is very fragmented. It is mostly European history, a bit of African history, imperial history of the explorers. And then I'm in Pakistan. And their history is we are suffering from obscuring our history. Our history starts with Muhammad bin Qasim. It doesn't start before that. There is nothing. So we grew up, I didn't have that, the Pakistan history, which is very flawed. Does that answer your question?
I thought you studied in England actually.
No, I came to England at the age of 40. Any others?
There's a question here.
I know it's not that much credit for a quick question, but I'm just really curious, out of all the books that you have read, which one that really impressed you? Each of you.
Well, I like P.G. Wodehouse.
What? One more time I couldn't.
I like P.G. Wodehouse.
I'm not answering that.
I guess.
There are too many books.
Yeah, I guess it changed.
I can't answer
really.
that.
Of course, there are too many books, and writers need to be
They
readers.
change all the time.
But one thing, if I can add this, as Turks, we read Russian literature a lot, right? We read European literature a lot, French literature. It's usually a one-way street. Like we read European literature more than Westerners read our literature, but we novels, short stories, everything. We grew up reading Balzac and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. So of course there's all of that in our upbringing. And also a lot of material, again, from Sufism, from Rumi, from Mesnevi. So it's quite eclectic. At least in my case, it's very eclectic.
One last question.
Recently, there's been quite a plethora of writers who have either from different origins but living somewhere else and writing. And I'm talking about the Indian writers because I read them a lot. Most of them, they show, the ones that are popular outside India, the ones that show India in not the greater light. Is that true in the other ways, and what are your thoughts on that? Because it kind of irritates me, but the books are good, so I just don't know what the literary response is to that. Because anything that's outside India, that's getting popular outside India, literary-wise, is not showing India in the greatest light possible. But is that...
Well, the purpose of books isn't to do PR, I'm afraid. A book that was PR would be hopeless. A book isn't an advertisement for a country or a world. If you think that, you don't know anything about books at all. It's absurd for you. Books are a form of criticism. Books are a form of interrogation of the world.
Like P.G. Wodehouse, it's funny. I mean, I wish there was a funny book that we, like contemporary writer writing things, but it seems like, I don't know, sadness sells more.
You can rephrase that. Well, are you trying to say that the books that are written by Indians are for an outside audience and they rubbish India?
No, they're written in India, but the ones that get popular outside India are the ones that are not very happy. Or I've seen it with Indians, but I don't know if that's the same with Turkish writers writing. I think
You know, what you're saying is, in a sense, it's happening all around the world. Like this, there is an identity politics all around the world. We usually talk about how fiction changes the world of politics, the real world, so-called. But the opposite is also true. You know, there's identity politics, and politics, power politics, is also affecting the way books are being published. Sometimes the way they're reviewed. I'm not saying the way they're written though.
Okay.
Okay, but the way they're reviewed, the way they're seen or presented or introduced. So I'm not putting the spotlight on the artist. You know what I'm saying? But there is this expectation, which I have felt a lot, especially in America. Like if you're, let's say, women writer from Algeria, okay? If you're a Muslim woman writer, there's this expectation you should be writing about the stories of women in Muslim societies, and those should be, sad stories. There is that expectation, but as artists, I don't think we should conform to that a lot. In one book, I might write a very happy story about a Muslim woman. In another book, I might write an unhappy story. In my next book, I might write about a gay professor in Norway, right? So keep going, keep moving. There's no end to this. We shouldn't listen to the identity politics. I don't think so.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think,
can I ask one
as far as time is
Then
concerned,
we have two more questions, but no statements, please, and please only speak to the microphone very closely.
My question is
So,
this.
two more questions. Wait,
Okay.
please, for the microphone.
Where's the question? Sorry.
Right here.
Oh, yeah, got it. Great.
Got it, yeah. I guess the theme today was childhood and religion, and I guess the theme of fear has come up a lot. I want to ask each of you, as you were starting to write, I guess from a young age, how did you come to write about sex, and how did that voice develop in your work?
Sex?
Sex.
Write about sex?
Love scenes, sex, sexuality.
Yeah, we can. Well, I'll quickly give you a very brief answer. In my case, I wrote it in humor. I wrote a diary of a very louche politician who was up to his ears in sex. And it was very risque. And I did it only through humor. I could not do it otherwise. Because I was in Pakistan.
They don't have sex in Pakistan?
They do have sex. They have a lot of sex in Pakistan. But they don't talk about it.
It sounds very good. The subject that you're referring to, which is really people's passion for one another, it's the only subject that there is in literature. People's desire for one another, which is both their love and their sexual passion and their interest and their whatever they want from the other person. That is the subject of literature, of all literature. And that's what we do, is to have one person, probably against their wishes, desiring another person. And there you go, you have a story, and then you have a father who forbids it. And you've even got a better story. And you would say that is the basis of all storytelling.
Thank you.
I think Elif.
Yeah, just I think whatever exists in life, we can put it on paper, in stories. But I understand your question as well, and especially in Turkey, I think there's too much attention on the novelists, on him or her as an individual, rather than writing. We don't discuss writing or books; we discuss our writers. So when you're a woman writer, especially for young women writers, because age is an important factor in patriarchal societies. As women writers age, they become more respectable, and I think it becomes easier to write about sex as you get older, But for young women writers, it's not that easy, because whatever people read on paper, they think it's your personal story. It happened to you. They completely identified with the individual who wrote it, and that can be very suffocating for the artist, for the writer. In fact, I think in 3 cases we can write more easily about sex. When you're a lesbian writer, and since you're already stigmatized in the eyes of the society, just go for it, and you can write about it. There's no more stigma. Or when you're an older woman writer in the eyes of the society, because as I said, you become more respectable. Or in terms of your personality, if you're okay with it, if you're a fighter, if you're a warrior, then again you just. Despite all the criticism, you write about it. In my case, really, honestly, it took me a while to learn. When I wrote Mahrem, the case, I remember seriously worrying, what people are going to say, because there was a scene of sexual abuse in the book, and I was kind of worried. Not because of the society. I was worried about my mom's reaction. What's she gonna think, when she reads that? So these things happen, but we still keep writing.
So if you want to write about sex, become a lesbian.
I guess this is the
And
Konuşmacılarımıza teşekkür ediyoruz. 10 dakikalık